the likelihood of more severe violence occurs not when the person is withstanding abuse, but when they are trying to leave. So that likelihood of severe injury increases by 70%. And that's not only in the Muslim community, but in the general community when someone is trying to leave. Within our own research, the saddest research that we do is our campaign called In Their Names, which goes back to when we ask, well, why do they stay? A lot of times folks stay and are silent because it's safer.
You're listening to Wise Women with Daisy Khan, where faith rolls up its sleeves as a force for good, and where women define the future with wisdom and wonder. I'm Daisy Khan. Kindly subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Welcome to a new series, The Muslim Women Project, where I feature 100 Muslim women of power and authority, shaping their destiny, community, and society at large. Today, we're talking about the home, a place meant to be a sanctuary, our source of sakina or tranquility, where we should feel the most loved and respected. But today, we will discuss what happens when a home becomes a place of fear, control, or violence. My guest will help break the silence on family oppression in Muslim communities. We will also find out what Islam truly says about oppression. How does abuse show up in the families? And most importantly, how do we stop it? So let's get started with my guest, Dr. Denise Ziya Berte, PhD, who is a licensed clinical psychologist with over 30 years of specialty in trauma, torture, oppression and war, interpersonal violence, and indigenous populations. She is currently the executive director of Peaceful Families Project, which is a 21-year-old national project addressing family-based violence in Muslim communities in the United States. Dr. Berte is the mother of 8 children and grandmother of 5. I have no idea, Dr. Berte, how you have the time to do all that you do. Welcome to Wise Women.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about this really important issue within our community.
Yeah. So I mentioned in my opening remarks the issue of oppression. Can you describe how Islam describes oppression, injustice, dhulm as we call it?
Absolutely. So one of the things that we at Peaceful Families do is to look at family-based violence through, as you said, through an Islamic lens. When we look at oppression at a global level, at a community level, and in individual homes, it's very clear to us that oppression and family-based oppression has always been a part of Islam. So we know that in Islam, oppression is talked about as something that makes Allah very unhappy, that folks who engage in oppression are not going, to see the beauty of Jannah. We know that we are told very specifically, what do we do when we see oppression? We stop it with our hand, we stop it with our mouth, or we hold in our heart. If we are not able to do anything, we hold in our heart that it is oppression, because we never want to be confused. We never want to mistake Allah's way from the way of oppression, from the way of injustice. In these teachings, we're even reminded that we have an obligation to the perpetrators of oppression. So if you remember the hadith, where the Prophet, peace and justice be upon him, is asked, well, what we know what to do with victims of oppression, but what do we do with oppressors? And on more than one occasion, the answer is, first of all, stop them from oppressing, because that stops them from really a sin against Allah and against the community, but also teach them, educate them that what they're doing is oppression. So we are taught about oppression from all sort of views within the Quran and Hadith, within the core values of Islam.
So our obligation is to transform the oppressor so the oppressor can also change their way of being.
And that changes not only for that particular victim, but for our community at large, for intergenerational trauma, for all of those kinds of things that we know are so important if we are going to stop injustice and oppression at every level, but certainly within our homes.
Yeah, so if we talk about oppression in general, it's so condemned in our scripture. How do we connect that to what happens behind closed doors, meaning in the familial and relational violence that we see that is also very oppressive? Can you define that?
What's interesting is that the methodology of oppression does not change, whether it's being done by a dictator, whether it's being done by an oppressive, military, whether it's being done by a community, or whether it's being done by an individual in the home.
Mm.
So we talk about this wheel of oppression, which looks at not just being physically beaten, being physically hurt. Sometimes that's the easiest kind of oppression to recognize because it's so obvious, right? You're
Right.
hit, you're hurt, people look at you and they feel sympathy. But we know that the facts about your own life and existence that you need to know, it has to do with restriction of who you can talk to, social isolation. It has to do with restriction of movement, where you're allowed to go and where you're not allowed to go, and with whom. It talks about emotional abuse, which, sometimes folks like the word gaslighting. This idea when you are in pain, somebody to tell you, oh, no, you're not, or
Yeah.
I did it, or you deserved it for in some way. And then there's also that hypercritical, that continual, you are not good enough, you will never be good enough. And then, of course, there's even the spiritual. Islam is turned around and used as a weapon. You are not a good enough Muslim. You will but be a good enough Muslim. God does not love you. God will never love you. God has said that you must obey me. All of those kinds of things.
I can't help but think of the women in Afghanistan because you talked about the social isolation, the emotional isolation, the financial, the physical, the spiritual. All of these things are happening to them. I feel like they are like birds in a cage with their wings clipped. And somebody just put a door to that lock. And it's no different than when somebody oppresses you at a societal level or at the level of a nation. So I know that you briefly mentioned the power and control wheel to describe how this abuse operates, and I'm sure for our viewers we're going to throw that up so they can see what it looks like. But can you break down the specific tactics?
Absolutely. So what we know about this system of abuse and oppression is that it's based on this internal belief of a perpetrator that they are somehow sort of blessed with the right to, and we see this language even with some of our global oppressors, right? That
Yeah.
they are given the right to have that sort of power of Allah to
Mm.
decide who is right, who is wrong, who should live, who should not, what they should do, and that they must be obeyed. So when we look at this methodology, it is about continually placing the victim, placing the other in a position where they have no power, no control, and no predictability, right? So things happen out of nowhere. Things happen almost no matter what you do. You are going to offend the person. You are going to get a punishment. You are going to be mistreated. You are going to have something taken from you. It is like walking literally on eggshells all of the time and having no ability to sort of get out of that prison, that cage that you talked about. They don't have the right to work outside of the home. They don't have the right to cook for their children what they choose. Everything that they do is monitored by and controlled by another human being, right? Not because it's based in the goodness or what will work for the family, but all of those pieces, they all have the same goal.
And I guess that's what also creates dysfunctional families, right? And we see a lot of dysfunction in America that leads these kids to isolation and becoming, picking up guns and killing people. So, are there any data points or stories that confirm that this is not a non-Muslim problem?
So we like to believe that in Islam, this beautiful deen that has everything laid out for us, that of course we will not fall into these difficulties. In 2023, PFP sponsored, along with a very prominent researcher, a look at intimate partner violence within the Muslim community in the United States. And unfortunately, the data is no different than the data in the general community, which is 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men have
Wow.
experienced violence. There was a statistic that close to 70% of Muslims knew someone in their immediate family who had been a victim of
Mhm.
family-based violence. Now, the difference is within Muslim communities, it is not always husband and wife.
Mm.
Sometimes it is parent to child. Sometimes
Mm.
it is older sibling to younger sibling.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is extended family members. And sometimes, even within the spousal situation, because it is based on power and control, sometimes that is men to women and sometimes that is women to men. And that's
Mhm.
to say that as much as we love to believe that women are just not violent and that's why we're victims, it really doesn't have to do with that. It has to do with who has the power in the marriage, right?
And the control, yeah. I'm sure that there's also similar data that minority communities don't tend to come out and air their dirty laundry, right? Then the silencing is it becomes a vital part of the community. What is the fear of not coming out and speaking? What do people fear?
I think there's multiple levels. And right now, we do have to talk about the situation of especially immigrants within the United States. So, right now, even the court is not a safe place to go to seek safety, right? So people
Yeah.
going in for an order of protection can be stopped by immigration and kind of taken away. So one is that there is that basic life fear that we do not get the same services and rights, especially our community, our immigrant community. And that's a fear. There's also so much misinterpretation of Islam. So we do have this fear, I think, because Islam has become sort of synonymous with domestic violence. And that to me is so not only offensive, but heartbreaking, given all that we know about Islam and what Islam did for the rights of women, children, travelers, all of our vulnerable populations. That's some of the earliest declarations of Sharia law were to save young girls who were being buried alive.
Yeah, infanticide.
So we know that this is not Islam, but there is this not only, and I think it's two things happen. One is that the social media, the media of the Western world has chosen this as one of those things to blame on Islam. And that has become a very sort of, if you Google, Muslim man, you're going to see somebody who's, looking crazy and violent and all of
Mm.
those kinds of things. And Muslim women looking small and fragile and easily hurt. So one is that there is a popular narrative in the Western world. Even within Muslim communities, there's a fair amount of misunderstanding.
Mm.
So people don't want to talk about this because they think maybe it's true. Maybe I deserve this. Maybe this is the way that things need to happen. In fact, it's so common. There are popular movies. There's an Indian movie that came out. I forget the name of it, but where there's multiple generations of women who end up killing their abusers because that's less shameful than divorce. There is the unfortunate data that talks about what happens when victims try to leave. And unfortunately, the likelihood of more severe violence occurs not when the person is withstanding abuse, but when they are trying to leave. So that likelihood of severe injury increases by 70%. And that's not only in the Muslim community, but in the general community when someone is trying to leave. Within
Yeah.
our own research, the saddest research that we do is our campaign called In Their Names, which follows public domestic homicides within the Muslim community. And we have lost over 45 souls past 2 years within home violence. I don't have the most updated statistics, but it is definitely over 80%, closer to 90% of those folks were in the process of separation or divorce,
Mm.
which goes back to when we ask, well, why do they stay?
Yeah.
A lot of times folks stay and are silent because it's safer The other thing is we don't always respond in a positive, protective way when people tell their stories. So,
Mm.
we had a case in Arizona, for example, where a young woman was searching for help and called and talked to, several people within her Muslim community, reached out to even a shelter who told us, well, we can't serve you because you want to breed children with you and we don't have room. She had 5 children and she
Yeah.
did not survive the night.
Mm.
So a lot of times, even when people get the courage to speak out, they don't get the services that they need.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate.
To add to that, which I've also experienced, this whole notion of the community reputation, right? The honor of the community. So let's
Of
say
course.
somebody breaks away. I know a young girl who was trying to run away from home because her parent wanted to force her into marriage, and she went to the mosque to try and get some help. And they told her, well, we can't do anything because your father's the president here. so,
Right. And we
so
forget that and in our own Quran, what do I say? We are judged only by our level of taqwa, right? So
exactly.
we are not judged because of our money, because of our standing, because of our beautiful Arabic, because of all of those things. We are judged by our taqwa. And we
Yeah.
know so
Yeah.
clearly that creating sakina with inside of our homes is the goal of marriage. I've had imams of very large congregations tell me, I've been an imam for 10 years. I have never seen a case of domestic violence. And I'm
Yeah.
always like, I see it in your parking lot. So I don't know how you could not have seen it, right? That's
They don't want to hear, they don't want to see, they
exactly.
don't want to know. Yeah.
Exactly. Or that folks are too scared. They're afraid of the consequences. The other thing that comes up certainly is that a lot of the perpetrators, not all, right? But a lot of the perpetrators of domestic violence are also in our masjids. They are
Yeah.
praying. And we've
Yeah. They're members of the community.
they are upstanding members of the community until they get behind closed doors. And we've
Yeah.
had victims say to us, I could never go to the imam. I could
Mm.
never go to the masjid because the perpetrator is there all the time.
Yeah.
They know this person and they trust this person, and they will never believe me. Even when folks get the courage to speak, they are silenced by folks who tell them either have sabr, it will all be good, this is God's will,
Yeah.
or are you sure? That's
Yeah.
almost the first question that victims get.
From your perspective, what do you see the ripple effects on the Muslim community? Like I know some women who were treated very badly and then lost their faith because if you're doing this in the name of my faith, then I don't want any part of it. What are you seeing?
That first impact level we do see, especially when um, spiritual means and text have been twisted and misused. It is very easy for a victim to say, I cannot trust Islam because Islam has been part of the weaponry that has been used against me. So it's very hard
Mm.
to reclaim your own faith. We see this also with children. So we know that 20%, 25% of children that grow up in Muslim homes in the United States leave Islam. And that's
Mm.
usually not because they want to celebrate Christmas or because other people are telling them things. It's because of what they see in their home and that
Mm.
they pair Islam with injustice,
Mm.
both against themselves or against their family members. So it's
Yeah.
very hard to believe in an Islam that has been represented within your family or within your culture as unjust to the poor.
Yeah.
It also, of course, takes its effects financially on our communities, in terms of broken families, in terms of, needing to move and to walk away. And one of the things that we do in Peaceful Families that's a little bit different is that we also work equally with men and women,
Mm.
because even if a victim leaves the home, divorces, that perpetrator is still a Muslim and they are going to
Mm.
marry again and they are going to marry another Muslim. So for
Mm.
us, it's not enough to help people escape and to make that the goal of our work. The goal of our work really is changing the way that we as Muslims view what should happen in the home, that we go back to Islam and the models that we have in terms of positive family functioning, in terms of mutual consultation, in leadership, all of those kinds of things, because this is our community that we're saving. And then, of
Yeah.
course, in the worst case is, in fact, this trickle down that we have, that now somehow Islam is synonymous with violence. Not only in terms of terrorism and all of that kind of narrative that we hear, but also in terms of family-based violence.
Yeah.
So that seeing a Muslim man love his children and hug them and be a good husband is somehow seen as antithetical, is somehow seen as strange, and not representative of our community, despite the fact that this is exactly what our prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, was the model of.
Yeah. So, I mean, this can also happen at a societal level, right? This oppression, this religious oppression, like we've seen in Iran, right? A lot of people turning to atheism. And we saw that with the Catholic community here in the United States with all the sex abuse. People just run away. They're like, I want nothing to do with this.
Exactly.
So this is not just it's a phenomena that cuts across all faiths because people want to see the faith represented, not by hypocrisy, but by the kind of morality that is within our scriptures. So, I mean, if we were to address the one verse of the Quran that is kind of twisted, where when it comes to condoning spousal violence, it's usually verse 434. And for our audiences, could you just describe what?
First, I'm going to read it specifically for those who do not know, right?
Yeah.
So, as to those women on whose part you fear disloyalty and ill conduct, admonish them first, then refuse to share their beds, and lastly, strike them. But if they return to obedience, seek not against them means of annoyance, for Allah is most high and most great. And that is, of course, 434, which we have been talking about. So, obviously, it makes it sound as if what you want to believe is that you have the right, as a husband, to bear violence on people in your family, then of course this is the verse that you are going to be drawn to. And I think, first of all, we need to look at the context of the Quran and the fact that this is written in the context of the chapter on women, right? That this is part of the Quran, the beautiful Quran that talks to us about marrying for sakina, that talks to us about the fact that we are all equal, that we are made of one soul. This is the same Quran that admonishes um oppression and violence and unjust violence. This is the same Quran, and very specifically in the context is talking about sexual impropriety. So again, we're not talking about you're disobeying your spouse for whatever reason. We are talking about a grave sort of error against Allah and against the community and against the rights of an unborn. Number two, of course, this is a very specific remedy, and it has many steps in correspondence to what we know about anger management today, right? So
Yeah.
first, you admonish them, you explain to them, just as we talked about in oppression, you let them know, hey, this is not okay. I'm very concerned about this. This is something against Allah and the community, not because you're hurting my feelings, not because you belong to me, not because you're my property, but because it is not okay in the eyes of Allah. Number one. The second thing is, so you first explain the situation. On top of that, we know that in Islam, we have the right to a peaceful parting. But so first we need to talk to the person and say, this is not okay. Then we stop sleeping and sharing with them. And then lastly, we have this word, and I don't like to get into arguments about what the word really means for differential levels of Arabic speakers. The word is hit in a very basic way, but it does not mean beat. It does not mean terrorize. It does not mean stalk. It does not mean shoot. It does not mean any of those things like that. We're very clear about. Even we might fight about, whether it's, with the weight of a feather or all of those kinds of things that people get into. We know that it does not mean domestic violence. It does not mean power and control, right? And that's really important. The other piece of this that we have, of course, is in fact the example of our prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, when his own wife, Aisha, was, there were rumors that she had been unfaithful. And what did our prophet do? Did our prophet yell and scream? Did he say vulgarities? Did he spit in her face? Did he kick her? Did he hit her? No, we know that what the prophet did with his grace and understanding was to move into the masjid, where he stayed quietly until the situation had been cleared, and then, went back home quietly and humbly and with the permission of his
Yeah.
spouse, who admonished him then for saying, "Why didn't you believe me?" Right? So we know through all of our examples and sacred text that this is not a verse that allows for oppression of any kind, and even domestic violence of what we see. And that's different even than the Western world, right? Because we do have what's called crimes of passion in Western crime, in Western legalistic systems, which, can almost allow someone to kill someone, because they have seen them, in a very compromising situation with their spouse or things like that. Islam does not give us that grace, right? Islam says oppression is oppression. This is the steps to sort of de-escalate a situation, but that physical violence and abuse is never allowed.
If you are to follow the prophet's example, then do what he did, which was to walk away from any conflict in the marriage. He always did that. So, I mean, if we were to go into how to stop this violence, what is the role of imams, and what should, how do they draw upon their leadership in terms of stopping and intervening early on, rather than just saying, well, this doesn't exist? What should they do?
Well, I think there are so many things. One is that imams are not our only answer. They're often put in situations that they have absolutely no training or skill set to manage, right? So the first thing I would say is for them to become aware and alert, not only about the situation itself, and we do national imam trainings on an annual basis, and then local trainings for imams as well, because they first of all need to be aware, not only about domestic violence, what are the patterns, what does it look like, what they might see, but also the Islamic basis, because a lot of them have not taken those verses that we have taken and really analyzed them deeply, right? So first is for them to be self-aware, to get the training and knowledge that they need. Second is for it to be something that we see every single day in the masjid, where sisters are given respect, where violence is taken seriously, not only violence between men and women, but violence between elder children and younger children. Talk about how that is destructive to our community, that there are other ways to problem solve. Giving men and men's mental health a space within the masjid, right? So that men feel open to talking about difficulties that they're having, depression, anxiety, having spaces for sisters as well to talk between each other. Amazing when we can have mental health professionals within the masjid to talk about things. And then the other thing is to know when to refer. When we're talking about family-based violence, you may feel outside of your realm. You want to know who the mental health professionals are, where the shelters are, what people can do for protection during that time. The other thing that we are doing right now is a multitude of programs, starting from parenting, young adults, youth, men, even folks getting divorced, so that we're talking about the potential for um, violence and yeah, maladaptive relationship skills all through the lifespan. How do we talk with our children? Because to be honest, children who are not ever abused are very unlikely to go into a household and create abuse. It's just foreign to them, right?
Yeah.
If we have young people who know about relationship skills, who know how to communicate, who know red flags for mental health, all of those kinds of things, they are going to be much better at being leaders. And then we even have a program for young men, what leadership skills do you have? We want you to, again, we don't need dictators. We know that that's not only bad for our homes, bad for our communities, but bad for that individual, because we know what the Quran says about people who use their power in negative ways, people who condone or practice oppression. So
Yeah.
that's equally important for us to teach. How then do we not do that? What does Islamic leadership look like? That's different than the leadership that we see in other words. The other last thing that we have a phrase called whispers of violence. Sometimes we hear, and to be honest, it's not always men. Sometimes it's mothers-in-laws and sisters-in-laws. Look at that person. Look at how they're disrespecting you. How long this is a dishonor to our family. How do you know this little, and know that when we hear that from our sisters, from our parents, even from people within our community, we need to confront that and say, hey, that's not Islam. That's
Mm.
not what can I do to support your marriage? What can I do to support you during this difficult time? Instead of sort of lighting that fire of under those whispers of violence.
That could also be done like as a part of an early intervention where you integrate these beautiful Islamic ethics into, reaching survivors and perpetrators. Because I think a lot of people don't call the suicide, watch phone number or domestic violence because they're afraid that they think it's not culturally congruent to their culture and then they wouldn't understand. So explaining this and providing all the resources in advance to people, I think would help a lot, don't you?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think women, we spend a lot of time in domestic violence talking to women. It's almost like preaching to the choir. Um,
They
the
need
I
to speak to boys and men.
absolutely, and let me tell you two stories. We had one gentleman. I was doing a talk in a West African ethnicity masjid, and I did my whole spiel, and an older gentleman, one of our elders came with tears in his eyes, and he said, I helped my sister leave an abusive situation, thought that she would die.
Mm,
But since that day, I
mm,
have been terrified that I will be held in judgment, that I will go to hell
mm,
because I broke up her marriage.
mm,
And he said, this is the first time that somebody said to me that what I did was an okay thing, not a good thing, just that it was an Islamic thing to do. And he had carried this guilt for doing something so Islamic, right? For
mm,
protecting his
mm,
sister from really death, but
mm,
that he had carried around this cloud, believing that he was going to be punished for saving her life.
mm.
Well, that's not our dean, right?
Wow.
You have a hashtag not our dean. The other story comes from one of the sessions that we had after one of the murders. And I want to be really clear. I use the word murder because that is what it is when we have domestic violence. And it was a case where there was a family, and it had it escalated and escalated and escalated. And one of the brothers came to us, an older, again, not elder, but an older um, brother came to us and said, we as men knew, and we saw this person sort of deteriorate before our eyes. And we heard him become crazier, his ideas becoming less logical, and we didn't know what to do, and we were scared. And
Mm,
all that we did was to stay away from him, was try to pretend he wasn't there. And this
mm,
person said, and I feel so guilty now because I really feel like we pushed him so far away that he had no other choice, right? That
mm,
there was no way back to our
mm,
community. So this idea of reaching out to a brother who you see struggling and saying, hey, let's go for a coffee, or, are you in therapy? I am. What else can we, instead of, again, just looking away and thinking, oh, it would be so embarrassing. It would be so disrespectful for me
mm,
to intervene, right? It would be so non-Islamic for me to call you out, brother, instead of really offering. Now, if we saw one of our community members going into a casino or going into a club, I can tell you, right? People would be easily, hey, what are you doing, right? But
Yeah.
for some reason, we think that this is different, that this should be private. But we know that the burden of our community is all of ours. And it will take all of us to really change what we do about that.
Ending violence requires courage, right? It requires you to speak up, but to listen, to lend support, to act. I mean, these are just normal relational things that we're supposed to do. And in these extreme cases, when we lend an ear, it goes a long way, right? Just like people
And it
want to
can
be
really
heard.
make a difference.
Yeah, they want to be heard. They want to be acknowledged. They want to know that somebody is there for them. So, I am in wrapping up. I just want to say to the listeners, if you need help, you're not alone. For culturally sensitive support, please seek out the Peaceful Families Project. Dr. Berte's organization is there for you. And for imams and community leaders, your proactive voice is critical to everyone. Challenge stigma, right? There's no, oppression is not something that we need to live with. Offer support and help build a culture of respect. And at the end of the day, I think when Dr. Berte, when we take all of this together, it seems to me like responding in a holistic way where you are acknowledging theology, community response, leadership, and having a cross-gender engagement. That seems to be like the ideal way of tackling this from all the vantage points. So I want to thank you, Dr. Berte, and I'll let you have a last word.
Thank you so much. What I would say is, first of all, Jazakallah khair for not only this opportunity, but all of the work that you do within our community. So we are very excited to partner with you in this way. What I would say is, remember that domestic violence is not something that happens at one point of life, that it really has to do with our relationships, from parenting to co-parenting, right? So at every level of life, please reach out to us. We have about 50 trainers across the country, but are always looking for more. We do imam training, and then we have a directory on our website. If you are in fact in need of immediate care, please go onto the website, find a service provider in your area, and take that step, because of course the first way of helping an oppressor is to stop allowing them to oppress. So that is something that you do not only for yourself, but for your family and for the oppressor themselves.
And for the community and the society at large, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And for Islam.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Berte, and audiences. Stay blessed. Until next time, this is your host, Daisy Khan. Thank you for joining me on Wise Women. If something stirred in you today, don't let it stop here. Share this episode with someone who needs it. Reflect on what resonated for you. And definitely plant one seed of change, however small. Remember, you do matter. And your actions have a ripple effect. But none of us can rise alone. To explore more resources and ways to get involved, do visit my website, daisycon.com. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review, because every click is your way of amplifying this message to others. Wisdom isn't just heard, my friends, it's lived. So let's live it. Until next time, stay wise and stay rooted.